right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Katy Alambo, and I'm the organizer for the Work to Grow program here at Nature Canada. Today, we are joined by three amazing conservationists who are going to be sharing with you some of their journey and experiences navigating this sector as BIPOC individuals. Before we go too far, as we always do at our Work to Grow presentations and gatherings, we would like to offer a land acknowledgement. So land acknowledgements offer us the opportunity to think and reflect on the history of the lands upon which we are situated, and to recognize the continued presence and role of Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Turtle Island. It's through this acknowledgement and recognition that we begin to show our commitment to moving forward and taking action to undo those past harms that continue to influence and affect peoples today. Recognizing that we are all joining in from different parts of the country, I'm going to do a land acknowledgement for where I am located here at Nature Canada's head offices in Ottawa, which are located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, who are the traditional and ongoing stewards of the lands and waters upon which I reside. In the context of our Work to Grow program, we would also like to acknowledge those who were brought over to these lands through the transatlantic slave trade, as well as through the adoption industrial complex. These historical and ongoing acts are connected to Nature Canada's work to undo the racism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism linked to the colonization of Turtle Island. At this point, if you would like to share where you are joining us from or just offer your own land acknowledgement in the chat, please feel free to do so. We also have two resources listed on your screen, whos.land and nativeland.ca. These are both resources that you can use to help you learn about the Indigenous territories where you're located, as well as for help on creating and crafting your own land acknowledgement. All right, so today we have been sharing this webinar more broadly than usual, and so there's possibility that some of you who are on our call with us today are not so familiar with Nature Canada. So before we go too far, I'd just like to give a brief introduction to who we are at Nature Canada. So Nature Canada is an environmental nonprofit that was established in 1939. So that makes us one of the oldest nature charity in Canada. Nature Canada works to connect Canadians with nature and advance conservation efforts across the country. We do this through a number of different programs and campaigns, but most notably, we advance these efforts working with our Nature Network partners, which bring together over 100,000 volunteers and 1,000 nature groups across Canada. So we're very thankful to have our Nature Network partners and for their support in doing all of this amazing work to protect Canada's biodiversity. So the program that we're talking about today, or that this webinar falls under the context of, is our Work to Grow program. So Work to Grow is a program that was launched back in 2021 following the publication of Nature Canada's Race and Nature in the City report. If you're interested in reading that report, I will provide a link to it in the chat during today's webinar. But in brief, this report helped us to highlight some of the barriers related to race that people experience when it comes to accessing and connecting with nature here in Canada. So a byproduct of the Race and Nature in the City report is our Work to Grow program, which is a wage subsidy program that is geared towards offering employment opportunities to racialized youth to help them get their career started and to start promoting a culture of belonging and inclusion in the environmental sector. All right. So without much further ado, I want to introduce our three panelists for today. So as I mentioned, we are lucky to have three amazing panelists who are here to share with us all this afternoon. I'll give a brief introduction to each of our three panelists, and then we'll jump into today's presentation. So first off, our first panelist is Aranya Iyer. Aranya is an ecologist who has a passion for conservation, particularly when it comes to species at risk. She is the co-founder of FREEZE, which is Field Research in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Diversified, which aims to increase access to field research and naturalist skills for Indigenous, Black, and racialized undergraduates. Aranya currently works as an Associate Specialist of Conservation Research on WWF-Canada's Science, Knowledge, and Innovation team. In addition, she has hosted the World of Birds segment for the popular science YouTube channel, Animal Logic. Thanks, Aranya, for being with us here today. Our second panelist is Peter Soroye. Peter is the Key Biodiversity Areas, or KBA, Assessment and Outreach Coordinator with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Here he supports research and communications for the Canada KBA program. Peter completed his PhD in biology at the University of Ottawa, where he focused on the impacts of climate change and land use change on pollinators, and has received recognition for his work, including the Canadian Society for Ecology and Evolution's Excellence in Doctoral Research Award. Peter is also passionate about community science and science communication, two things that are also very dear to my own heart, and has appeared in various media and spoken at schools and other public events to share. Thank you, Peter, for being with us this afternoon. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by Daniel Gladu Kanu. Daniel is an Anishinaabe, Irish, and Métis man from Animaki-Wazing First Nation with a biology degree from the University of Winnipeg, and he serves as the director of the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective. For the past 17 years, Daniel has worked alongside Indigenous communities across Turtle Island to support their food, land, and water self-determination. His work has been deeply influenced by the teachings and ways of living passed down from his ancestors. So thank you, Daniel, as well, for being with us all. So a big thank you, Kwe Miigwech, to all three of our panelists. And so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we will get into today's presentation or panel. There we go. All right, so the plan for today, we are going to spend about 45 minutes to 50 minutes on our prepared panel questions. After that, we'll move on to our Q&A session, where I'll pose the questions that have been shared by you, our audience, with our panelists. So the first question that we have for you today: what motivated you to pursue a career in nature conservation and the environmental sector? And how has your identity as a Black, Indigenous, or racialized person influenced your journey?
Yeah, thanks, Katie, for having us, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to be here and recognize some familiar names, so I appreciate your attention. Something that inspired me to get into conservation is birds. They have kind of been my inlet into conservation, and I like to joke that I was born like this, trying to look at birds wherever I went. And that primarily stems from my dad's own passion of being an ornithologist and ecologist. And I just absorbed all of the information and knowledge and wisdom that he had while growing up. And our dinner table conversations were kind of just like, oh, did you hear the song Sparrow? Are we sure we saw that shorebird? So I've just like grown up hearing that. And my mother specifically, she really looks at all living beings around her as her own family, and she speaks to them as such. And so this value of respecting all living beings that way was brought up in me. So pairing birds and then valuing nature kind of went hand in hand together to try and pursue a work in conservation. When it comes to how my identity plays a role in this, I think it has played a huge role in starting Freed, which you gave such a generous introduction to, so thank you for that, Katie. But it really stemmed from, I feel so lucky to have grown up in the environment that I did, with my mother and father being so supportive and having a very supportive community, especially when it came to finances. And so how can we recreate that space for other people, especially from Indigenous, Black, and or racialized background, to really provide them a space within the university sphere where they get to connect with professionals such as yourself, Peter, and Daniel, and others on this call. So that was kind of the starting point for Freed.
Awesome, thank you. Peter, same question.
Thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be here as well. It's really grateful to join a really excellent panel, and happy that this event is going on. It's a really great one. Yeah, in terms of kind of what motivated me to pursue a career in conservation and environment, likewise, I grew up a lot outdoors and spent a lot of time, hiking and camping. My parents took me out, took us out as a family. That was kind of our family vacation we would do every summer, was camping for a couple of weeks in Algonquin. That was, we'd have like aunts and uncles and my grandparents come out. It was really awesome, and definitely like my father came immigrated to Canada from Nigeria, so like camping was completely foreign to him. So it was, I really like admire his like bravery and like jumping into this like completely alien idea. Camping is not at all common in Nigeria, so shout out to him for like jumping us into that. And my mom kind of grew up camping in Southern Ontario and stuff, so yeah, I feel really grateful to have had that opportunity growing up and spending so much time outdoors. It really like instilled in me a really like, I always had this piece kind of outdoors and wanted to kind of keep that and share that. And so conservation was a really natural kind of career path for me to go into, one that I'm really passionate and excited about. In terms of my identity and how that's influenced my journey, I'm Black, I'm mixed, and so it played quite a big role. And I think one of the things that really influenced me and was my kind of passion and how I've embraced science communication and that aspect of science as well. I really, the importance of it for me has always been really personal, having like grown up and not seen a lot of Black role models in science or biology. There are people doing this that have been doing this for a really long time, but it's hard to see them, especially when I was in high school and whatnot, and even undergrad, like just a few years ago, in grad school a few years ago. So they're becoming more and more visible, and there are a lot more stages and spaces that kind of highlight that work that's been sometimes left out and left outside, or kind of not had the spotlight that it deserves. So for me, science communication has always been important to kind of create that space and let people know that there are people who are out here doing this as well. It's a space that everyone can be in, and there's maybe not a lot of us, but still a good amount that are out here doing. So for me, science communication and being able to share the work, make it accessible to others, that's been kind of deeply tied with like my identity, is like making sure that representation is there for for other Black people that want to get into the field.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter. Your comment about camping reminds me of my own father. As Peter knows, I'm also half Nigerian, and also my dad did not camp. Totally didn't make sense to him either. All right, thank you. Daniel, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Katy. Yeah, I think like for me, I grew up in what I guess would be like Northwestern Ontario or Treaty 3 area. Really like surrounded by lakes, and it kind of I think I take that for granted to a lot of, that's where I was. We'd see moose and all that as a kid, and fish, and but there was a moment in high school, all my uncles and my dad started to go on canoe trips, and they went on a couple before I was allowed to go, but then they invited me out, and so I was able to go and join them, and it was just such a great time getting to know my uncles, and getting to know my dad in a lot of ways too. But there was one particular trip on Isinglass Lake, which is a kind of crystal clear lake. You can actually see the shadow of the moon on the bottom of the lake in the middle of the night. Just kind of an amazing place. Very small, pretty hard to get to as well. I remember being there and just kind of wondering what I should be doing with myself, and thinking I should be doing this. I should be working for this kind of lake and land. So that's where I started to look into university, and I think one link to that as well is that my uncles got pretty excited and started to like say, especially as I was finishing university, started saying like, "Oh, you should apply here. You should go here. You should work there." And yeah, I think that they were really helped and encouraged me to get to this place. So that was good. Yeah, and then in terms of identity, I think for me, there's been a lot of like trying to figure out who I am in this space. I'm often like, I'm white passing, and I carry a lot of privilege that comes with that. But also trying to understand where I fit in terms of, speaking for or with my communities. So there's a lot of me trying to like navigate and figure out what that means and where I belong. Sometimes feel like it's you want to be a helper and try and do a lot of the work And sometimes I've had to have people remind me to like take a step back and also think about how I relate to the work. And yeah, so that's a little bit about that.
Thank you all three. It sounds like you all had some early experiences, like early on in life with your families, that really helped to kind of nurture and foster that love of nature, and bring you where you are today. So I will move on to our next question. Can you share a pivotal moment or project in your career that significantly shaped your perspective on conservation or climate work, especially as an Indigenous, Black, or racialized person? Aranya.
Happy to speak to this, but also going to say I just searched up Isinglass Lake and it looks gorgeous. It looks so clear. So thank you for sharing about that, Danielle. In terms of a pivotal moment or project, I would say it would be the events that we hold at Free themselves. And so this is where we have hopefully very welcoming spaces for undergraduate students, and we try and very intentionally create these spaces where there are as few barriers as possible. So we try and fundraise for everyone's financial any needs that would kind of hinder individuals from participating. So we cover transportation, accommodation costs. There's no costs to like coming to the course itself. And we also try and fundraise for the honorariums for everyone to join us, recognizing that they are giving us their time and are doing a kind of work while they are at the program. And so one of the pivotal moments during the events is when we have a career fair and we talk specifically about what does it mean to be a professional Indigenous, Black, and or racialized person in this field, and just hearing everyone's experiences in those moments, it's really validating, and it's really impactful for me to listen in on even the difference between when I was an undergrad and how I engaged with these topics, and then how students in undergrad currently are engaging with these topics, and really seeing how over time there's been such an growth and intersectionality of things. So how people are looking at how all of their different identities are coming into play and how that is interacting with their relationship with the land, and how the immigrant experience, especially for me, how does that play into being on, like, immigrating to someone else's territories and lands and trying to build a relationship there and trying to understand the importance of language, and then also trying to bridge that gap when I go back home to India, and what that means. And so, yeah, it's just always really, really amazing to hear everyone else's perspective on this and hear about everyone else's relationship to the land that they're on and sometimes to the land that they come from.
Thanks, Aranya. I think that that's a very important point. I think that you've brought up, those sharing of perspectives and changes that we've seen over time, even in terms of like racialized representation within the field. I think that's a big part of the Work to Grow program, is in providing opportunities for more diverse perspectives to be shared within our sector. Peter, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like that. I love that example, Aranya. That's really beautiful. That was going to be you had shared these questions earlier, Katy. That was going to be a similar one of like going to conferences. My first conference that I went to, scientific conference in 2017 when I was just starting grad school, was like all about biodiversity. And it was the most homogenous crowd I've ever been in. It was probably like 400 people, all white faces or white passing faces. And I remember being like, the only Black person there. And then, a lot of conferences as I was starting under or grad school kind of were the same way. But they're starting to get more and more, more and more diverse. You're seeing more and more people there. So that's really exciting. I really like that. I was going to use that, but I think a funner example, or maybe another interesting one to contrast, is an experience that I just had actually like this year, which was courtesy of BEI, Black Environmental Initiative, which I know is another group that Work to Grow works with quite a bit. And they're based in Toronto, a really, incredible, small, but really incredible team that does a lot of work in communities and trying to get, Black and racialized communities better connected with nature and connecting different leaders and stuff like that. And they had set myself up and 5 other really incredible Black leaders in the environmental space with a trip to the Arctic with Adventure Canada. So we were in the Arctic for 17 days, is myself, Andron McCoy, Larissa Crawford, Aaron Isaac, Patricia Wilson, and Zwenna Gray, who are all incredible leaders and people doing amazing stuff. And we were in the Arctic, which was incredible, Western Greenland and Nunavut. But the most incredible part of that trip, going into it, I was so excited to see like polar bears and beluga or whales and stuff like that. But the most incredible thing, and it was being on this boat for 17 days with, obviously there were like, 200 other guests on board. But the six of us it was the most time I've ever spent with other Black kind of people in conservation. And it was the most magical experience. It was like from literally the first day, everyone, just the chemistry was incredible. Everyone got along so well. And being able to spend like that much time together, experiencing something so magical, such like a once in a lifetime type of experience, and being able to experience it with like all these other people who have gone through such similar experiences, and coming from such like similar but wildly different backgrounds, and taking on, different elements of conservation and environmental action in similar but incredibly different ways too. It was so magical. And it was really like there's, a lot of Black, a lot of Indigenous, a lot of people of color working in the environment and conservation, but it seems sometimes that we're so spread out and it's hard to like build those connections and really spend that time. And so these 17 days this summer was just one of the most magical times of my life, because it was just being able to spend that time together and kind of build those connections and just like learn so much from all these people who have kind of built such an incredible foundation and are doing so much to shape, conservation, environment work across Canada at large. So that's what I'll go with.
Thanks, Peter. That sounds like such an incredible experience. I mean, not only going to the Arctic, because how many of us get that opportunity, but to be able to do so with a group of people who have had similar experiences, life experiences to you, must have been amazing. I'm definitely jealous. Over to you, Daniel.
Sure. I was like, mine was actually an example of a conference as well, but we were asked to, I guess me and a few people were asked to support maybe indigenizing a conference in a way that it took us quite a while. We spent almost a year planning to bring people to a caribou conference back in 2010, so some time ago. And it was really amazing because caribou was like this place where this conference in particular, again, all scientists, like I said, just no diversity there. And remarkably, caribou is, for Indigenous people, for Dene people, Inuit, it's like the, a literal mother, right, in terms of their creation stories, and something that is just critical to their life, ongoing, right? And yet they were excluded, implicitly, explicitly in this conference, and so we were asked to kind of help with that. And I think there's a lot of things we were able to do to really support that. We had some keynote speakers, we helped with travel, a lot of things like that. But we also held what was essentially a large talking circle with about 50 like Indigenous land users, elders, leaders. They all came and they spoke with each other, and we spent an entire day going around the circle a couple of times, hearing the stories from people. And then others from the conference were also invited to come and listen in, right? So they were, but the central folks were people who have seen like caribou as like part of their lives, right? And in a way that is, from birth to death. And I think it was very important for a lot of the scientists to see that. And also, as caribou science has a real like kind of nasty history, like very racist about, white people telling Indigenous people what was wrong with caribou, what was at risk, banning hunts, displacing communities, all those kinds of things had happened. And some of the people in that room had done those things, right? And started, we're throughout the conference, we're starting to, come to terms with some of that. And so there were some powerful moments as well. So that was a big one. And then, of course, anytime I can get on the land with youth has always been very good. So.
Thank you, Daniel. I think like definitely, I know how important the caribou are to Northern Indigenous folk, and I think that like that is such an amazing experience for the Indigenous people who are part of that conference, who were brought there to help with that indigenization, but also for others to have those other perspectives to be brought in and to be confronted by some of the not so great aspects of the work that they do. Thank you. All right, so I'll move on to our third question. So as leaders and experts in the field of nature conservation, what resources and advice would you recommend to young people who are just starting their journeys in this industry? And how can they best prepare themselves for the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. And there's the way that I've sometimes answered similar questions is like there are practical things that you can do, and then there are more big picture things that you can do. Obviously, when it comes to very practical things, is getting out and spending as much time on the land as you can, and just trying to get into like trying to understand the different connections, trying to build a relationship. There is the leader for Brown Girl Outdoor World. She's the co-founder, Demisha Dennis, and she says you only want to take care of the things that you love. And so really centering those relationships has been important for me, and I assume will be important for anyone who wants to pursue a career in this field. The other thing is just like subscribe to newsletter to any place that you want to work with. Oftentimes that's where they're going to be posting their job opportunities. Connecting with places like Work to Grow is also great because you also share job opportunities there. Following as many of those places on LinkedIn as you can, because that is where they're also sharing news of what is happening in their organization. And then just, as is kind of common to most industries, like just getting out there and networking and talking to people and making sure that you have a story of like why this is important to you, what you are bringing to the table, and like where you see yourself, and then how are you going to use that to benefit larger communities. So those are some very practical things, but I think the overall thing is just like, for me, sitting with my values and trying to understand how does this align with who I want to be and what vision of the world that I want to try and bring into the future and for the next generation is usually kind of the big picture thinking that I also encourage others to do. And I try to do it as much as I can, but sometimes get bogged down by some of the more practical little things, but always a good reminder for me to also do that.
Awesome, thank you. Very good advice. I think stuff that we share all the time through Work to Grow with participants and what have you. I definitely love that tagline, like people protect what they love. It's one that I use a lot too, and I think it is very true. So getting those opportunities to connect will really are critical in helping to set that foundation. All right, Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great tagline. And I think that it speaks as well. One of the things I wanted to mention here as well was like being able to share, kind of communicate your passion for nature is super important. Like even if you're not, the best person identifying every bird call, or even if you can't like, tell what a tree is from the other side of like the field, just being like excited about like being outside and excited about like, oh yeah, I can't wait to like, be excited about like identifying plants or bugs or something. Like people like in the environment, I think, regardless of what you want to do in nature conservation, like communication is so important and building relationships is so important, and being able to build them around like, parts of the outdoors or like nature that you love is like just the easiest way in. It's like, yeah, kind of the easiest foot in the door, a way to kind of like build a relationship is to start nerding out about, some weird part of nature or some fun part of nature, or like a beautiful like canoe trip on a lake and stuff like that. So I think that's like a really great skill to cultivate, is like, being able to just like share that passion and not being like nervous or like, anything there. I think that's a really great skill. In terms of like resources, advice, one of the things that I think has been super important for me is like having a good foundation of like friends and family around me at like all points of like my journey, whether it was like in undergrad or grad school, or whether it's like, now kind of like in the workforce working at WWF-Canada. Like I really need to have stuff kind of like outside of just work, even though I think being in nature conservation, it's really easy to just be like locked in and like, I need to save the world. I need to do everything I can. But it's really important to take care of yourself. And it's really important to like have people and networks and kind of communities, whether they also care about nature, whether they're also in the field, but just like having something outside of work that like helps pull you away and helps you like recenter and kind of like relax and like have fun. So like whether that's, you know, family that's nearby or whether it's like really good friends nearby, like I think that's super important to kind of cultivate and make sure you have that foundation. And you know, burnout's really is a really real thing and really important to take care of and make sure you're taking care of yourself. And also like, especially being, you know, Black or racialized or, you know, part of some of these underserved communities or communities that have been historically excluded from nature conservation, it really important. You're going to have to deal with a lot of like, unfortunately, probably going to have to deal with a lot of microaggressions or straight out aggressions, and having those networks and those foundations is really important for helping just stay resilient in the face of that and helping to kind of move forward in a positive way and not get, you know, completely turned off or bounced away if this is your passion. Other things like networks or like resources that I think are super great as well. I mentioned Black Environmental Initiative, groups like that, and groups like Work to Grow, like Aranya mentioned and Katy mentioned, are super awesome. But groups like BEI as well, like, you know, they'll do like community events and things like that. Being able to kind of join those and get to know some of the community, I think is a really super thing. If you're interested in like the scientific side of nature conservation or kind of the science side of things, Canadian Black Scientist Network or other like scientist networks or professional networks and societies are another really good kind of place to kind of build connections and find kind of like common minds or mentors that can help kind of, you know, provide advice that's maybe more specific to like the exact field and niche that you want to get into. And if you're younger in like undergrad or even high school and stuff like that, things like Let's Talk Science, I think are really great, either to participate in or kind of convince your teacher to participate in if you're in high school or whatnot. And if you're an undergrad, I know these were like really great networks for me, like to help build communication skills and science communication skills. And also like I know in Ottawa, they have some like groups, subgroups of Let's Talk Science that are focused on like talking to like, you know, Black youth and being kind of mentors to Black youth in high school and stuff like that. So you can really, I think, build great networks and really make a difference even in undergrad as you're kind of learning and figuring out where exactly your career is going to take you. So yeah, I think those are really great. And the final piece of advice that I think that I always try to give is just like reach out to people. If you see someone doing a job that you really like, whether they've, you know, are just starting out in it or have been doing it for a couple of years, don't feel bad about like sending a LinkedIn message or a Instagram DM or a Twitter DM or whatever social media app people use these days. But I think people are generally like super happy to chat more about how they've gotten to the place they've gotten to and super happy to act as mentors. Even, you know, people might be really busy and it might be hard to set up meetings and stuff, but I think people are generally super happy to talk. I know I am, at least. So don't hesitate to reach out and create some space for you or opportunity for yourself there as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter. I think like, yeah, definitely reaching out to people, like strengthening your network, like just like talking to people. I think like you mentioned, right? Most of us in this field, we are super passionate. We're really nerdy about nature and doing that kind of work, and we want to connect with other people who do that kind of, who are also like in that sector. And so being open to reaching out and just like, yeah, taking that first step. You also mentioned, Peter, a number of different organizations that are like Black led, or we have others that are like Indigenous led or led by other racialized groups. And it's just making me think. I have a bit of a list of some of these organizations. So I plan to share that out probably through our Work to Grow newsletter at one point. And then as we improve our website, maybe it'll exist there as resources as well.
Yeah,
all right,
I'll post some of those in the chat as well. I'll take some time as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you. All right, Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I absolutely agree with that. Like just that reaching out thing is so I think really underdone in a lot of ways, because like there are people, maybe the three of us or the four of us would be falling over ourselves to support people who, you know, yeah, we know have a hard road and have, you know, there are many places looking for, you know, whether it's like employees or partners, volunteers, all those, there's all kinds of opportunity, right? So, and it's amazing just how intimidating it was when I was younger to try and make those connections. But as I did make them, I was almost always rewarded with like some kind of kindness, right? So, and if someone was too busy, often I was still given some support or directed in some other way. So I think it really can't hurt. One of the other things though I think I often found really funny is just while I think everyone's very genuine in how they approach things, I do think that there is a certain degree of people just don't really know what they're doing. So even as you get far in your career, I'm still struggling to figure out, am I doing the right things? Am I doing it in the right way? And so it's like trying to remember that like even experienced people, we're all sort of, humble humans as well, right? And constantly making mistakes, and hopefully we can help others not make some of those same mistakes, but also just to remember that we're just doing our best as well. And I think to some degree for the people who try and really show that they're, uh, have everything put together, often they don't, right? So you should remember that, however you feel, it's like those feelings have been shared by others. And maybe to some degree, I think that this is something I've been struggling with lately, thinking about how a lot of the things have been tried. So as we look at different protection, conservation, even research projects, a lot of these things have been tried in the past. And I start to think like sometimes they need to be redone, right? And there'll be some resistance, like people who have, oh, we tried that already, we're not going to do it again, right? But I do think that there's a need to keep coming back and really start bringing these ideas forward again. And maybe it's like, maybe we're learning from those mistakes and trying to do more. But also like maybe the timing is right for this society to do something new or try something that has been tried in the past. And then I guess lastly too, just I think that like conservation organizations, movements like academia are still struggling with what it means to be human in wilderness. Like, I mean, think for me, like people are part of the land, part of nature. So the work we do can be like really integrated into that. And I think that's also true in cities, right? For a lot of folks, we're maybe stuck in a city, but that is also can be part of nature. And you can, if you are able to open up to it and see the birds and the trees, get to the water, there are places of nature everywhere, right? So being able to try and connect, because I know it's not always easy to get out into, the greater wilderness, I will say, but it's still there everywhere you are. So.
Absolutely. Daniel, you touch on so many different points that have got so many thoughts going in my head. I think that just your last point here, just connecting with nature and recognizing that like there is nature all around us, even when you are in a city. And Nature Canada runs a program, Naturehood, and that's kind of what it's geared towards, getting kids who are in cities opportunities to like connect with nature. And sometimes that nature is just in their backyard. You also talked about how even people who are established in their careers can also feel like they don't know things, right? We talk a lot about that idea of imposter syndrome, especially with people who are just starting their careers. And so maybe if any of the people who are on the call have felt that themselves, like keep in mind that we're all kind of doing that. Even those of us who've been doing this kind of work for a long time, we all still have days when we're like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so we're all just human. We're all kind of trying to figure this out as we go. And so maybe having that in mind will make it a bit easier to kind of reach out to people and do that kind of networking. All right. So the next question that I had was all about community and mentorship, but I think all three of you did a really good job in answering that through that last question. So maybe we'll skip that one and I'll move on to the next question I have on my list. So the nature and environmental sectors are predominantly white Western spaces. How do you foresee the process of integrating Indigenous and non-Western perspectives into these fields?
Yeah, this is a really powerful question and a very deep and like multifaceted, it will have very deep and multifaceted answers. I can speak to what we do specifically at Freed. So we work very closely with Christine Lucas-Sawich of Wasaya Consulting, and she is Algonquin from around Algonquin Park, where we do a lot of our programming. So the first year, she gave a background of the history of the land, specifically how the park was created and how a lot of the Algonquin people were displaced as a result, including members of her family. So we started off the workshops with that history in mind, and she also really helped us understand, like, even as scientists, and I think this was also one of the questions that showed up in the chat, like it's not just us with study subjects or study objects, it is us in relationship with them. And so she really helps us like bring a relational lens to the animals and the wildlife and the different aspects of the land that we're studying. And so in terms of integrating, over the years, we started working with her closer and closer to integrate Algonquin knowledge, history, ceremony, names, Anishinaabemowin names into our workshops, to really give that level of history and that understanding for each of our workshop instructors. And it eventually trickles down to our students. And we hope that eventually it'll have ripple effects of whenever they go back to their own communities, to their academic pursuits, that they take that with them. And one of the key ideas that she really references is Dr. Zoe Todd's work of what do the fish think? And so a lot of our instructors, especially when they are, say, teaching about fish or trees or dragonflies or snakes, it's kind of like, what do the snakes think? And that really also helps you understand the words that we have in Western science of like natural history, behavior, and it really just takes another different approach to it. So language is a big part of it, and then working with people who come from these kind of knowledge systems is also a really big part of it.
Thanks, Aranya. I think that is amazing. I think the fact that you're able to connect with an Algonquin to actually, you know, kind of give that information about the land. It kind of reminds me a bit of like what Daniel was saying, right? That idea that being belonging in nature. I think I recently was attending another workshop where we talked about Robin Wall Kimmerer's works, and she had this one essay about nature as a source of belonging versus belongings, and remembering that we too are part of nature, as you were mentioning, Daniel. And I think it's very important that we take that time to situate ourselves. And I do see that change happening within the sector. We're seeing it happening more and more and amongst scientists and researchers and what have you. And I'm just very happy to see that happening and hope to see that to continue. And sorry, I have been messing up things on the chat. The chat should be open to everyone now. I made a mistake. It was only hosts and panelists, but if you want to use the chat now, it should be working. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this work is so important. This integration of Indigenous and non-Western perspectives into the environment space and the conservation space as it's being done. I think it adds so much, and it's really, you know, I feel I'm seeing a lot of more work that's like taking a more holistic approach to things and a more like holistic lens in terms of the things that it considers, not just considering a single species in an environment, but trying to take that bigger picture. And I think that adds so much. It just makes so much more sense to conservation and the environment. But it goes beyond that as well. And kind of there's a lot of limits of, you know, the ways in which we think, and kind of trying to do things like add Indigenous knowledge, when what we should be doing is kind of like integrating these these perspectives and kind of rethinking at a higher level is important, but challenging even when you're really well intentioned, and bounds that are, I think, often kind of applied from funding and reporting requirements and kind of timelines that are imposed from high up. So I see a lot of challenges. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it will end up being a really slow process, and I think that's unfortunate, but I think to do it properly, is more important than maybe jumping, it is important to do it really properly. And it's exciting seeing a lot of like organizations that are doing that. Free to Think is just such a super example of like incorporating that from the beginning and like threading that all the way through. And it'll be really exciting to see how bigger organizations and larger projects with, you know, different scopes from very local to maybe more national, how is that done at the national level? I think is a really interesting question to ask, and one that you know, in my work with Wildlife Conservation Society Canada with the key biodiversity areas, this is a national scale program with an international tool. And how do we, like, with those in the bounds of that type of structure, how do we kind of integrate these different perspectives or incorporate these different perspectives in a meaningful way that isn't just kind of, you know, lip service or kind of, you know, throwing in some more sentences about of a land acknowledgement or something. How do we meaningfully incorporate that type of information and meaningfully work with communities is a really important thing. And it, yeah, kind of more holistic lens is always better. So I don't know if I answered actually like anything about the process, but I hope that was at least some, I hope that was at least something. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. I mean, I got something out of your answer. I think you did a good job there. You brought up that idea of change and trying to maybe incorporate and kind of pair having a more holistic lens when we're looking at these kind of these topics. And I definitely agree. It's one of those things where I'm constantly talking to people about like how the interconnected nature of like ourselves and nature and everything that's going on in it. Change is hard, and we have already had this history of certain practices. But you also brought up that idea of this work, these changes being made slowly. And I think in some ways that is a good thing sometimes too. I know that it can be, maybe that's a little like counterintuitive when we talk about things like climate or biodiversity crises, but I think we have this colonial like culture of urgency that kind of permeates all of the things that we do. And if we all just took a little bit more time to slow down and think things through and collaborate a little bit more, that we would see some great progress. All right.
Yeah, really. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just to jump, I think that's the really important thing, is like allowing that space for those timelines and like allowing that space for that time and to happen is, yeah. Thank you for summarizing my thoughts in a coherent way.
No worries. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, it's really a big subject, right? Well, I have to agree. Like I see integration is really like a generational thing. Like it will take that kind of time, and part of that is because it's very people. From what I can tell, all the success is really around people who are driving it. So for Indigenous knowledge to be really part of a process, you need Indigenous people to be part of a process. And even today, we still largely don't have processes that include Indigenous people, even when it's directly about them or issues affecting their community. I have a hopeful concept that like I don't think like many professionals today are really capable of really integrating, and that's okay. We're hopefully we're laying some foundation for that, but that I do think there are like young people who maybe are going to be able to bring that, who are going to be able to actually do that integration in a way that isn't just like a parallel or starting to like dabble back and forth, but more of a fulsome like understanding both worlds, right? Or many worlds, depending on how you look at it. Yeah, just to really one of the problems around white spaces, I'm seeing it in terms of like water organizations. I find it particularly problematic just how few have Indigenous leaders in their boards. Often organizations that work almost exclusively on drinking water for Indigenous nations will have no visible Indigenous people in leadership. And I have to wonder how are they able to approach that really authentically, right? And not just as a like charity for someone else, right? And I see that across the board with all kinds of things. And I did want to point out the way like Lake Winnipeg, its history in particular has this effect of showing its racism, right? We have little examples of lake communities that just said like no one but white people could be there, of course. And even as those things have been, they were those laws were removed, right? Of course, the effect still lingers, right? Because who owns cottages? It's the people who owned cottages previously, right? And those communities are not welcoming or hadn't been welcoming for a long time. And then, of course, it's like this north-south lake, and a lot of the science, a lot of the like intention, a lot of the care for the lake is devoted to that south basin that is primarily white, closer to the city, closer to researchers, whereas the north basin often struggles with getting any kind of scientific attention or like media attention. Huge algal blooms happen in the North Basin all the time, but it'll get reported in Winnipeg as a great year with no real algal blooms, right? And so the way we talk about a place like Lake Winnipeg has really demonstrated that to me, and I'm sure that examples like that exist all over Canada for sure. And then I think the last, and actually quite importantly, is just the resources, right? So when we expect science to be translated into policy, it's because it has generations of investment from every level, from the government, in universities, helping students become scientists, helping profs do research, make books. All that stuff has been happening so that they can then translate that into some type of policy or regulation, or technology, what have you, right? For an Indigenous knowledge user, they've never seen anything like that kind of resource. We'd be talking about billions of dollars investment at this point, and instead we have people who are expected to come for a single day rate, right, to just share knowledge, right, and just somehow translate it to how we're going to manage hydro dams or things like that. So I do think that we really are going to need not just a cultural shift, but that kind of resource provided to people. Yeah, and I could go on for a lot of what I do in my work. So it's a very important issue, and we're very far from really addressing it.
Absolutely, I definitely agree, and have seen that myself. Daniel, have working in watershed organizations and working with different First Nation communities, just the lack of resources and capacity that they have, and the challenges that brings with it, obviously, as you know, and how we focus our resources on those communities that have already historically been getting those kind of things. You also brought up like that important point of like the lack of Indigenous leadership on like boards and in higher leadership positions, and that's definitely something that is seen across the sector. I think I quote often Statistics Canada had recently done a survey of environmental, or the nonprofit sector as a whole, and looking at the environmental sector when it comes to leadership positions and board membership, you have very, very low representation from Indigenous communities or Indigenous people, as well as other racialized people. And so obviously that's what we're trying to change here. And I know with the work that you do at the Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective too, bringing in those voices to share and promote that work. Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more of our panel questions before we move over to the Q&A. So the last question that I have for you three today, what changes or initiatives have you seen recently in the nature and conservation sectors that give you hope for a more inclusive and diverse future?
Yeah, this is a good question, and also touches on something that Daniel said of like this work takes generations and someone has to think about it now for it to be implemented eventually later into the future. And I think a lot of folks have been talking for a long time how the biodiversity and climate will go on to intersect every single sector there is out there, whether you are thinking policy, finance, any of the major systems that we have currently. Everyone is going to have to think very deeply about how our interactions with the land then cater into everything else that we do. And so in terms of changes or initiatives, I think I've been seeing a lot more job postings and a lot more willingness from these larger, especially colonial institutions, to consider things under the label of sustainability, under the label of climate science. And it's a good start. It's definitely a good start. There is a lot more work that needs to be done. There is some level of greenwashing that happens. There is some level of like, we're just trying to tick a box that also happens. But people are talking about it, and people are trying to listen to folks on the ground from years ago to say, okay, we actually do need to start thinking about this deeply. Even if we're doctors, nurses, engineers, like we have to think deeply about how the environment plays a role in all of this. And so in terms of giving me hope, it is giving me hope that what I've want to believe that no matter what skill set you have, you can bring it into the environment sphere. It's becoming more and more and more of a reality as time goes on from what I've seen. And I can only hope it continues in that way and becomes more authentic and true and well-intentioned over time, and that the execution of it is also, you know, done more peacefully and with the least amount of harm as possible.
Absolutely. I think like we already touched on that idea of interconnected, but I think it's becoming more and more obvious to more and more people just how connected everything is. And I think we can't just think about these things in silos. It's all has to be thought of together. Peter.
Thank you. Yeah. I think what gives me the most hope is similar. Is kind of seeing these like conversations like continue and kind of grow, and like the frequency that they happen at, and kind of the, you know, how deeply they happen as well. I think that's really really encouraging to me. And it's seeing like, you know, going back to like these conferences that, you know, every year I kind of go to a, you know, a scientific conference or a meeting or something, and seeing just like more and more people there. Like there's more and more people, more and more faces, more and more diversity, more and more like perspectives that are coming in and backgrounds that are coming in to these conversations. And that, like, I think, you know, that just keeps providing more and more examples and just reinforces like how important it is to have these different perspectives and meld these different ideas together. Like we have, you know, biodiversity and climate and everything else, all these other problems in the world, and we kind of need every solution and perspective that we can to try to tackle these, and like Aranya said, try to like solve these in a way that causes the least harm as possible, and kind of gives us the best, you know, just the best outcome. So for me, like the most positive thing is seeing events like this, seeing like initiatives like Work to Grow and groups like BEI, seeing like NGOs, and kind of, I think every, you know, a lot of environmental and organizations that I see in Canada are like thinking really seriously about equity and diversity and inclusion and justice and accessibility, and in addition to like trying to integrate Indigenous frameworks and perspectives into their work, you know, to greater and lesser extents in all of those different items. But seeing those like conversations happen, and, you know, thinking of a longer, you know, longer term perspective, it's encouraging to see this start to roll. The ball's rolling downhill, and hopefully it picks up soon.
Absolutely. That's one of the great things that I get to experience coordinating the Work to Grow program, is seeing all of you out there doing that amazing work. So like Peter's saying, it's happening, it's growing, we're seeing more and more of it, and it's very encouraging. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, one of the things I feel like I used to see a lot, and maybe less so now, is that people were, people could see that there was a problem. So I guess just be like white people could see there's a problem, but then couldn't figure out what to do, and largely felt like I kept having to tell people like, well, you should like pick up the phone and talk to somebody. You know, they you know, we exist just as people, and like I'm speaking really about Indigenous people, you know, and just for the most part, like pretty much every First Nation community I've been to is very welcoming. Actually, just about any like BIPOC community that I've been able to spend time with is just like so welcoming, right? And I always find it funny that people struggle with like just starting those relationships. And I kind of get that like the way governments work or the way organizations work, there's some sort of timeline that they have to follow, a 1-year work plan, and you know, building relationships doesn't really work with that, never has. So I think that's one thing I feel like I'm starting to see just broadly, that people are just like starting to do some of that work, and we're starting to see people be able to naturally work from a place of a relationship rather than like trying to solve some objective or something that they have to do. So that's been good. I think in terms of the other thing is that Indigenous for like communities and grassroots organizations are doing more to just say like we're not going to participate in this without meeting some of the needs of the community, right? So I'm starting to see that, and I think more and more First Nations have really like written that out as a policy, right? Like this is what we're going to do in order to participate in research, work with organizations. There's some attempts for the conservation groups to like bring together a big like forestry plan, back in like I think 10 years ago, that really fell through because they didn't at all speak to Indigenous people. And so that now I'm starting to see those organizations have done a lot to like, well, okay, now that's what we have to do. We have to actually work with the people who live in these lands. So that's also been good. And then another thing I've been I heard about more recently was this organization called Rights Relations Collaborative, which is in BC, and so I'm not able to really interact with them too much in terms of my direct work, but it was an attempt to kind of redo how funding happens, and that instead of Indigenous groups being approached by like different foundations or nonprofits to do the X project work, this was more of like a group that was helping to kind of like oversee that a little bit and make sure that there was genuine integrity in how they approach that. So it was something interesting, and it's collaboration with many different First Nation groups, language groups in BC. So I'm curious to see how that shapes up and what they're able to like learn from that process. Yeah, and because I think that there is a need for foundations and where the money's coming from to be decolonized, I guess, to use that, and yeah, recognize that like where a lot of this money has come from and the kinds of things it's been reinforcing all these years has really been state building instead of people building.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I've recognized myself over my time, like in this sector, the importance of relationships, the importance of just kind of building relationships for the sake of relationships, so that we can kind of have those conversations to begin those collaborations. But you bring up some great things, and I'm going to have to look into this Rights Relations Collaborative, because I know that applying for grants, I mean, for those of us working in the environmental nonprofit sector, we know what that's like. And like we touched on before, the lower capacity that we often see in these First Nations communities makes the whole process even more, like it's compounded upon. And so it's great to see that there is an organization that is working to help facilitate this process. And I know in some of the organizations that we partner with, or that I've worked with in the past too, we offer those that support to the First Nations communities that we work with too. And so just an extension of that relationship building. All right, so we are just past 4 o'clock, and so I think we are done with the panel portion of today's webinar. Thank you all panelists for doing such an amazing job answering all of my questions. It looks like we have a couple of questions that have come into the Q&A from our audience that I will field. I also received a couple of questions from registrants as well, so I will also touch on those, but we'll start with the ones that have come in recently. All right, let's see. This one is an interesting question. I think I definitely want to get this one asked. Do you ever feel that as BIPOC individuals, you have more privilege and opportunities due to equity, diversity, and inclusion frameworks becoming integrated in the workplace or like political agendas for reconciling with colonial impact? So I guess, yeah. Does it need to be reframed, or was that clear? Sorry.
All good. Should we still keep the same order?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. That's a big question. I'm not sure I would necessarily see it framed as a privilege or opportunities. I think some of the questions that you asked, Katy, right now, like speak to how the default space and the current space is more Western, more white, more colonial. So when we are trying to create space as BIPOC individuals for other BIPOC individuals and other members of marginalized communities, I think it is a lot of work that goes into that and is pushing against a system that is consistently saying no in many different ways, whether it be through policies, practices, funding opportunities. So I'm not sure I would exactly use the word privilege. And I will say, yes, there are a lot more DEI initiatives. There is a push for more inclusivity, but those things take time. And so oftentimes it is also the individuals from BIPOC communities who are asked to take on that extra labor that is sometimes not even recognized or compensated in any clear way. And so, yes, workplaces, especially big institutions, can set these agendas. It then often falls on BIPOC individuals to execute those agendas, and then it is still measured by the metrics and indicators of the larger institution and the colonial systems. So is there privilege and opportunities to do some of these works? Absolutely. Does it always happen in the kindest, most straightforward, compassionate manner? Not necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a really great answer. I second all of that. I think they can be really effective, I think, if they're really well designed and implemented, but that's rare to see, I guess, and hard to actually accomplish or execute. I think like the flip side of it too, that I've felt at some points and heard from other people as well, is sometimes I think it adds to imposter syndrome as well. From, if you're getting a grant for, research grants or something in grad school or something, I think, sometimes it adds to that as a BIPOC individual getting that grant. You can have a feeling that other people maybe perceive that you got that because it was, because of an EDI initiative or kind of a consideration of that. That's definitely not true. Like people who get those awards, are have earned them, and these initiatives don't, are meant to kind of correct systemic like issues with these systems and how they're awarded and whatnot. But I think sometimes they can add to it. So I think, yeah, like DI initiatives are, when they're well designed and kind of well implemented, are really important, and really help provide those opportunities, and kind of correct those power imbalances and privilege imbalances. But there's, yeah, some different sides to them as well if they're not executed well, like Aranya said. And then I think, I don't know if you ever, I hope we get away from this like feeling of like added imposter syndrome that can come from them sometimes, but I think that's important to acknowledge as well. And if anyone feels that way, I know it's useless to say don't feel that way, but just know that you're not the only one, I guess, that feels that way. So
Yeah, and maybe to follow, I don't think I have that much to add really. Like it's definitely not a privilege. It's just more work and more responsibilities. The whole sector, right, and every organization, it runs on a deficit of having very few perspectives, and for them to change that, they've needed to change their practices and set targets and measurements and do some of that work. And that has I guess could be perceived as an opportunity, but ultimately it's because that opportunity hadn't been fulfilled many years prior, right? And it's still like everywhere I look, it's still the best positions are being filled by like white people because they had the best schooling, in the last generation and so on. And that's still true, I think, largely, right? So to say that we're in a place of privilege for diversity equity we're not even close to that yet.
Thank you all for.
Maybe I should maybe the other thing I meant to add too, just around colorism, right? Because I know for myself, like I think initially a lot of Indigenous hires were really looking for someone like me who has blue eyes and white skin and presents really nicely to a group of white people. And so I've benefited hugely from that, more so than I'm benefited from being Indigenous. And so that's been my experience. And I still think that's true to some degree. I'm happy to see that it's less true, I think. But yeah, I don't feel like we're there.
Yeah, thank you all. I think like it was a big question, and I think you all did a really great job answering it. It's a core question, something that I obviously, running this kind of a program, think about a lot. And I think that you all highlighted some of those very important things that just go to show why these programs are important. And I definitely agree that it's not necessarily a privilege. Yes, maybe they're offering more opportunities to us, but that comes with a number of caveats with it as well. All right, let me see. Let's do, this question is somewhat related to our last one. So how do you navigate in white majority spaces? So like being looked to answer for anything that has to do with racialized people. So kind of having to answer for your rights.
Yeah, this is often very difficult, and especially when working with smaller nonprofits who have limited capacity. Sometimes they see you as the young person or the female person or the BIPOC person, and they're just like, ah, you write our DEI policy. Who else is going to write our DEI policy? And so in terms of like navigating that and looking for answers, I think it's a muscle. It's a muscle I don't have yet. It is a muscle I am learning to flex, but learning to say no and say, actually, that is not my skill set. I am a scientist. If you want to talk, like if you want me to talk about birds, I am more than happy to tell you about the migratory strategies of warblers. If you want me to write a DEI policy, maybe get someone who is who has a major in that. And if that means that I'm no longer a good fit for that organization, that's fine. Maybe that's not my space to be in at the moment. So in terms of navigating those white majority spaces, learning very, very, very slowly to say, no, maybe this opportunity isn't for me. And maybe the way that I saw it is not how it's meant to be. And in that, I recognize that I come from a big point of privilege to say that I have the resources and the ability to say no. But when I can, and when it feels right to, I will try and exercise that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, saying no, and flexing that muscle. The other like on-ramp to saying full no, or like the alternate compromise to saying full no that I use quite a bit, is trying to just redirect, or used to use quite a bit. I don't encounter this problem too much anymore, fortunately, but is just kind of redirecting people to the experts, or to people who know the experts well. I think that can often be, especially if you're like younger, if you're being like tasked this by, and very new in a position, or when you feel like you feel a lot of pressure, then being able to redirect can, for me, was like really helpful for like, and, feeling like there was still going to be something, like, because I think there's also a feeling sometimes saying no that like, oh, well, they just won't do this anymore. And if I don't do it, then nobody will. So being able to suggest somebody else is, yeah, really important. It is important to say no, because you are, you have been presumably hopefully hired because you're an expert in, in your field, and a excellent professional in what you're doing. And, if that's writing DEI statements as well, or kind of policies as well, that's awesome. But if it's not, then you shouldn't have that kind of forced upon you. But yeah, being able to redirect, I think, is important, is a good tactic as well.
I would say, like, I think a lot about this in terms of consultations and that have happened, like with government, they'll say, and largely what I am mostly needing to just really point out is that there's just like no Indigenous people around the table, no people of color on this table, and you're not going to get the kind of detail and richness of an answer I would like to give about my own personal, because you haven't included others, right? So that they need to do better in terms of that reaching out. Yeah, that's, I think it's basically, yeah, it's a type of saying no, right? It's just demonstrating, like, if I look around this room, around this call, I'm not seeing the right people here, and so you're not fulfilling this in this moment, right? You're not, the questions you've asked can't be answered, right? So.
Thank you. I think that you all said it, but yes, knowing when and how, and that you can say no, are all very important things. We actually here at Nature Canada did a whole staff training about saying no to our colleagues, and so I can let you know, at least in some organizations, people are taking that seriously, and recognizing that, hey, we don't have to say yes to every single request that is made to us. So we're just at 17 past the hour. We're supposed to wrap up shortly. I have one last question for you all. It's kind of come up in different ways through some different channels. So I'm kind of like bring them all together and kind of make it a little bit concise. So what would each of you say are some key steps that organizations can do or can take to help get youth who haven't had those opportunities to connect with nature, to give them opportunities to connect with nature, or to engage them in sustainability and conservation work? And before I pass that off to you all, I think one great resource that might be helpful to answer this question is Nature Canada's Race and Nature in the City report. So I'm just going to offer the link there in the chat to everyone. But yeah, I'll pass it back over to our panelists to take for their take.
And I'll just start by saying thank you, Peter and Daniel, for letting me speak first on all of these questions. Your patience is much appreciated in that. In terms of what can organizations do, especially to try and engage youth, I think it is paying people who know what to do that work. And kind of touching on Daniel's point, not just one person, multiple people, and having that diversity of voices present. And so a big part of FREED is like for BIPOC students by BIPOC students. And like when it comes to what organizations can do, like there's no way to solve the diversity crisis by hiring one person. That is not sustainable, and that person is not, hopefully they do, but it's about a change in environment, it's a change in culture. And so hiring multiple people who can do that work, and the experts, there are so many, there's like obviously everyone on this call, but within us, we have so many networks of these amazing individuals across Turtle Island and beyond who can help do this work, and paying them, recognizing their efforts into doing this work is a great start. And then asking them what they should do is constantly like asking and trying to learn from others.
Yes, I agree. I don't think I have anything to add. Go to the experts. And there are people who do a terrific job, and their entire kind of like profession is built around building those connections, and programs like FREED and programs like or groups like BEI that kind of run events like that. So there's a lot of, or Black Girl Outdoor World that Aranya mentioned as well earlier. There's a lot of like experts, a lot of people that do that and do it incredibly well, and already have the networks that are set up to kind of like to do that. And just like if we were going to do any other program, we would kind of go to the experts as scientists or as like conservationists or environmentalists, and this was really no different, I think. And I'll just add, thanks, Aranya, for going first and kind of breaking the ice on all these questions. I know I really appreciate it.
Daniel, anything to add?
I got one of the things that I'm feeling is that the being prepared to like follow through. So it's like one thing to like listen and one thing to hear and understand, but also to actually follow through on what you're doing. And like be held accountable for that, right? So if you're going to have a conversation about difficult subjects, how are you following that up? What are you doing to change after that, right? Because I think we can all improve on different things, right? So if you're going to go through the work of talking about it, why not do something about it? And then the other is like, so this the organization I work with, the collective, we work with we've been supported, I guess, by this Lake Winnipeg Foundation, which is a non-Indigenous foundation, and it was very important to me that we emphasize the need for reciprocity in our organizations, right? That they didn't just see that they were constantly giving to us, and we were going to be thankful for that, but that we've also shown them a lot of things as well, and we've been of good support and provide them with perspective, but also some of our own expertise that has to do with the lake and with the sector and the way we approach things that they've learned from us, right? And the more they've been able to recognize that, the more I can see that we are actually having a healthy relationship, and that's something I'd like to see more in this work as well. It's not just about a one-sided transactional relationship, but there is back and forth, right? That's where we know we have something real to work with.
Absolutely, thank you. so much, all three of you, for sharing on that. I think one thing that kind of came through from all of your answers is just like having those people there, right? Like having that kind of representation. Like I said at the top of our webinar, part of why we launched the Work to Grow program was to create those opportunities to have increased representation within the sector, so people feel like that it is a space for them as well. All right, so we are at 4:23. I just have a couple of last minute things before I let everyone go. But before that, on behalf of our audience and Nature Canada, I want to thank all three of our panelists, Aranya, Peter, and Daniel, for sharing your time and your experiences with us all. I mean, I feel like all of your journeys super inspiring. You shared so much information. I think that our audience have learned a lot. I've learned a lot, lots of takeaways that I have from everything that we've discussed now. I'm just going to quickly share my screen because I do have some contact information if anyone is interested in learning more about the Work to Grow program. So you can connect with us or me, because most of these contacts will be connecting you with myself. The QR code that is on your screen will allow you to subscribe to our Work to Grow newsletter. So if you're interested in any more resources related to getting started in the environmental sector, launching your career, what have you, that newsletter is a great place to go. I also will share job opportunities and openings that arise through our Work to Grow program, as well as just other opportunities that come up with our Nature Network partners. So if you are on the job hunt, that might be a great place for you to look through our newsletter. You can also connect with me directly, like I said, via the email worktogrow@naturecanada.ca. Or if you would prefer to have like a one-on-one meeting with me, I do make myself available to everyone for that. So you can use that link on the bottom, the Calendly link, to book some time with me. I know we talked a bit about networking and connecting with the right people. And so if that's something that you're looking to do, booking a meeting with me, we can have a little chat, and maybe I can help connect you with the right people to help you on your career journey. All right, I just stop this here. All right, so thanks again, everyone. It was great to have you all. So nice to see you all. Some of you again, Daniel, nice to meet you, see you face to face on a screen. Thanks to everyone who joined us from wherever you're joining us across Turtle Island. Thanks so much for all of the great questions that you all shared with us. And I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.